August 1982. The southern waters of Lake Baikal, Siberia. The silence of the Soviet wilderness is shattered. 7 men break the surface of the water, not with the calculated precision of elite soldiers, but with the desperate flailing of drowning victims. They are gasping for air, clawing at their masks, screaming in agony. Blood is already trickling from their noses and ears. These are not amateur divers. These are the frogmen of the Soviet Navy Spetsnaz, the most lethal, highly trained underwater reconnaissance unit in the USSR. They have been trained to endure freezing temperatures, psychological pressure, and combat with the West. But today, they are not fighting Americans. They are fighting for their lives against physics itself. Just seconds ago, they were 50 meters deep in the black abyss of the world's deepest lake. Now they are floating on the surface. They have ascended too fast. Nitrogen bubbles are expanding explosively in their bloodstreams. It is called decompression sickness, the bends. Without immediate medical pressure chambers, their blood will turn to foam. 3 of these men will be dead before sunset. The other 4 will be invalids for the rest of their lives. The official military report filed that evening would claim this was a tragic training accident due to equipment failure. For decades, the families were told it was a simple mistake. But deep inside the archives of the Kremlin, the real report was stamped top secret. It didn't mention equipment failure. It described an encounter with unknown underwater entities, humanoids, 3 meters tall, wearing silver suits but no oxygen tanks. What exactly did those 7 men see in the darkness of Lake Baikal? And why did the Soviet High Command order them to capture a creature that clearly did not belong to this world? We are about to open the red files and expose the truth behind the USSR's deadliest underwater encounter. If you are ready to explore the classified history that was kept from the West, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Welcome to the deep. To truly understand why 7 elite soldiers were destroyed in mere seconds that day, you must first understand where they were. Lake Baikal is not merely a body of water. To the geologists who study it, it is a massive rift in the planet's crust. To the locals, it is a living, breathing god. And to the Soviet military, it was the ultimate fortress. Hidden deep in the desolate wilderness of Siberia, Baikal is the oldest and deepest freshwater lake on Earth. It holds 20% of the world's frozen fresh water, more than all the Great Lakes of North America combined. It is over 1 mile deep in some places. If you drained the water, you could stack 5 Eiffel Towers inside it, and they still wouldn't break the surface. The water is so unnervingly clear that you can see 40 meters down with the naked eye. But below that crystal-clear surface lies a terrifying, pitch-black abyss that has remained unchanged for 25 million years. For centuries, the local Buryat people have whispered legends about this water. They do not treat the lake as a geographical object. They treat it as a sacred entity. They speak of the lords of the water, strange silver-skinned swimmers who live in crystal palaces deep in the tectonic rift. Old fishermen on the lake have always warned their children, do not look too deep or something might look back. But the Soviet Union did not believe in ghost stories. They believed in strategic dominance. During the height of the Cold War, Baikal was the perfect testing ground. It was isolated, difficult to reach, and impossible for American spy satellites to penetrate fully. The Soviet Navy realized that the extreme depth and unique acoustic properties of the lake made it the perfect laboratory for their newest submarines and underwater weaponry.
By the early 1980s, the Trans-Baikal Military District had established several restricted zones around the lake. These were places that did not exist on tourist maps. It was here, in this frozen, silent, and ancient water, that the Soviet military decided to conduct their most advanced deep-water reconnaissance training. The commanders thought they were the masters of this domain. They assumed the only things watching them were the fish and the bitter Siberian cold. They were wrong. They were trespassing in a house that did not belong to them.
The men chosen for this mission were not ordinary conscripts. They were members of the Soviet Navy's elite reconnaissance divers, often referred to in the West as frogmen. In the Soviet Union, their existence was barely acknowledged outside of the highest military circles. These soldiers were the tip of the spear in the Cold War, trained to sabotage enemy ships, secure landing zones, and conduct underwater espionage against NATO forces. To earn a place in this unit, a soldier had to be physically perfect and psychologically unbreakable. They were trained to operate in conditions that would kill a normal man. They swam under ice sheets in the Arctic, conducted night operations in the turbulent Black Sea, and could hold their breath for minutes at a time while carrying heavy equipment. They were disciplined, rational, and, like all good Soviet officers of that era, they were strict materialists. They did not believe in ghosts, gods, or little green men. To them, the only threats in the water were American submarines and equipment failure. On this particular day in August 1982, the team was overseen by Major General V. Demenyenko, the commander of the Military Diver Service of the Ministry of Defense. The presence of such a high-ranking officer suggests that this was not a standard training run. The unit was testing the limits of human endurance and the capabilities of their equipment, likely the IDA-71 rebreathers, advanced closed-circuit systems designed to leave no bubbles on the surface, making the divers invisible to enemies from above. The mission profile was routine but demanding. They were to descend to a depth of 50 meters, roughly 164 feet. At this depth, the pressure is immense, squeezing the lungs and saturating the blood with nitrogen. The water temperature in Baikal, even in summer, barely rises above freezing at that depth. It is a hostile, crushing environment where a single mistake results in death. As the 7 men checked their gauges and slipped into the dark, freezing water, they felt a sense of professional calm. They were in their element. They trusted their training, they trusted their equipment, and, most fatally, they trusted that they were the apex predators in this lake. They had no idea that they were descending directly into the territory of something far more advanced and far more dangerous than anything the Soviet Union had ever built.
The team reached their target depth. 50 meters down, the sunlight from the surface is nothing more than a faint, dying gray glow. The silence is absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of their rebreathers. At this depth, the lake is a world of shadows, where distance is hard to judge and every shape looks like a threat. Then, the movement caught their eyes. It wasn't a fish. The movement was too deliberate, too intelligent. At first, the commander likely assumed it was a surprise test, perhaps another Spetsnaz group sent to ambush them as part of the exercise. He signaled his men to be on high alert, weapons ready. But as the shapes drifted closer out of the gloom, the logic of a military exercise fell apart. There were 6 of them. They were humanoid in shape, possessing 2 arms, 2 legs, and a torso, but that is where the resemblance to humanity ended. These beings were gigantic, towering over the Soviet divers at nearly 3 meters or 10 feet in height. They did not swim like men. They glided through the water with an effortless, almost unnatural grace, moving against the water pressure as if it didn't exist.
As they came into clearer view, the divers froze. The beings were encased in tight-fitting, metallic silver suits that shimmered in the dim light. Their heads were completely concealed inside smooth, spherical helmets that gave away no facial features. But the most terrifying detail was what they were missing. Every human diver knows that to survive underwater, you need bulky equipment, tanks, regulators, hoses, buoyancy compensators. These giants had nothing. No backpacks, no hoses, no exhaust bubbles. They were surviving at a crushing depth with no visible life support system. They simply hovered in the water, forming a loose semicircle around the Soviet team, watching them. They showed no aggression, only a cold, clinical curiosity. If you are fascinated by these classified encounters from the Soviet archives, take a moment to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment below. Tell us, what do you think these creatures were? For the divers, the initial shock turned into a primal biological fear. They were staring at something that defied the laws of physics and biology. They were the intruders here, and for the first time in their careers, the elite soldiers of the USSR were completely, helplessly outmatched.
In any other situation, the logical response to encountering an unknown, superior force would be immediate retreat. Survival is the primary instinct of every living thing. But these men were not civilians. They were instruments of the Soviet state, bound by a rigid chain of command that did not tolerate cowardice or independent thought. Upon establishing contact with these entities, the situation was relayed to the command post. The reaction from the surface was not one of caution, but of opportunism. Major General Demyanenko, monitoring the operation, allegedly did not view these giants as a threat to be avoided. He viewed them as a resource to be acquired. In the paranoid logic of the Cold War, if these beings possessed advanced technology, the Soviet Union could not afford to let them go. If they were biological specimens, they needed to be dissected and studied. The order came down through the hydroacoustic communication system, cold and absolute. Capture one of the specimens. It was a command born of breathtaking arrogance. The leadership believed that 7 armed Spetsnaz soldiers were capable of subduing a 10-foot-tall entity that survived without air. They treated the situation like a wildlife capture mission, underestimating the target in the most fatal way possible. Reluctantly but obediently, the divers shifted from observation mode to combat mode. The fear was still there, screaming in the back of their minds, but their training took over. They began to communicate with hand signals, coordinating a tactical approach. They unfolded a large, heavy-duty net, intended for capturing enemy divers or equipment. The plan was simple. The group would split up. 2 divers would approach from the front to distract the entities, while the others would flank them and cast the net over the nearest creature. It was a primitive strategy, trying to catch a superior intelligence with a mesh trap. As the divers began to close the distance, the silver-suited giants did not recoil. They did not flee. They simply watched the humans approach with an unsettling stillness. They allowed the divers to get close, perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps because they knew something the soldiers did not. The men raised the net, muscles tensed, adrenaline flooding their systems. They were seconds away from making the biggest mistake of their lives. The trap was set, but they did not realize that they were the ones who were about to be caught.
The moment the lead diver cast the net, the atmosphere in the water changed instantly. There was no struggle, no physical combat in the way we understand it. The creatures did not pull knives or fire projectiles. They simply reacted with a speed and power that made the human effort look pathetic. According to the surviving accounts, just as the mesh was about to settle over one of the beings, a blinding flash of light or an intense acoustic pulse erupted from the center of the group. It was a shock wave of pure energy,
silent but devastating. It didn't tear the divers apart, it did something far worse. The force acted like a massive, invisible hand, grabbing all 7 men simultaneously. It overcame their weight, their equipment, and their frantic attempts to swim downwards. In an instant, the soldiers were stripped of their agency. They were no longer elite warriors, they were ragdolls caught in a hurricane. The physics of diving are unforgiving. When you are 50 meters down, the pressure is 6 times greater than at the surface. The air inside your lungs and your blood is compressed. To return to the surface safely, a diver must ascend slowly, inch by inch, allowing the nitrogen to dissolve harmlessly. A rapid ascent from that depth is a death sentence. But the force generated by the entities didn't care about human biology. It propelled the squad upwards with violent velocity. The men were shot toward the surface like corks popping from a champagne bottle. The ascent took only seconds. In those terrifying moments, the divers likely knew exactly what was happening to them. They could feel the pressure dropping too fast. They could feel the gas in their bodies expanding, ripping through tissues and blocking blood vessels. They clawed at the water, trying to stop their rise, trying to grab onto anything, but the momentum was unstoppable. They breached the surface of Lake Baikal with a violent splash, tossed into the air by the residual energy of the blast. The calm training exercise had ended. The silence of the underwater world was replaced by the groans of dying men. The battle was over before it had even begun, and the price for their arrogance was about to be paid in full.
The scene on the surface of Lake Baikal was a nightmare that no military drill could have prepared the support crew for. 7 of the Soviet Union's strongest men were dragged onto the decks of the support vessels, writhing in agony. They were not suffering from combat wounds. There were no bullet holes or lacerations. They were being destroyed from the inside out. They were suffering from acute decompression sickness, historically known as the bends or caisson disease. When the unknown force threw them to the surface, the nitrogen gas that had dissolved into their blood at high pressure suddenly expanded. Millions of microscopic bubbles formed instantly in their veins, arteries, joints, and brains. Effectively, their blood was turning into foam. The pain of such an event is described as blinding and absolute, like having glass shards grinding inside every joint in the body. The only cure for severe decompression sickness is immediate recompression. The divers needed to be placed inside a hyperbaric chamber, a sealed steel tank that increases air pressure to simulate deep water, squeezing the nitrogen bubbles back down to a safe size before slowly releasing the pressure. But here, the tragedy turned into a catastrophe of logistics. The military outpost on the shore had a recompression chamber, but it was a standard unit designed to treat only 2 men at a time. They had 7 casualties, all dying before their eyes. The commanding officers were faced with an impossible mathematical problem. If they treated the men in shifts, the ones waiting would certainly die. Panic and desperation took over. In a frantic attempt to save as many lives as possible, the medical officers made a fatal decision. They forced 3 of the divers into the cramped chamber simultaneously. It was a violation of all safety protocols, but they had no choice. The remaining men were left to wait or retreated with field equipment that was woefully inadequate for such severe trauma. The attempt failed. The damage to their bodies was too catastrophic. Despite the desperate efforts of the doctors, 3 of the elite divers died shortly after the incident. The nitrogen bubbles had caused massive embolisms in their hearts and brains. The 4 men who survived did not escape unharmed. They were left with permanent disabilities, severe joint damage, neurological issues, and the psychological trauma of an event that officially never happened. The greatest underwater unit in the USSR had been decimated in minutes, not by American torpedoes, but by their own commanders' greed for the unknown. In the days following the disaster, the Soviet machine did what it did best. It erased the truth. The survivors were sworn to absolute secrecy. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements that threatened them with treason charges if they ever spoke a word about the silver-suited giants. The medical records were altered to reflect training accidents and equipment malfunctions. The families of the dead were given medals and lies, but never the real story of how their sons died. For years, the Baikal incident remained a rumor, a dark ghost story whispered by Navy veterans over glasses of vodka. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the files began to leak. Vladimir Ajaja, a former Navy officer and a prominent researcher of the phenomenon, was one of the first to bring these details to light. He confirmed that the Soviet Ministry of Defense had a massive archive of such encounters, and Baikal was just the tip of the iceberg. But the question remains, what did those men actually see? Skeptics argued that at 50 meters deep, suffering from nitrogen narcosis, the brain can hallucinate. They suggest the divers saw a seal or a strange rock formation, and panic did the rest. But hallucination does not explain the physical force that threw 7 grown men to the surface. It does not explain the specific, consistent description of the beings given by all the survivors independently. Were they extraterrestrial visitors using the deep lakes of Earth as hidden bases, far from our prying eyes? Or is there a more unsettling possibility? Some researchers believe these entities are not from the stars, but from right here, an ancient parallel civilization that has shared this planet with us for millennia, hiding in the 70% of the Earth that we cannot live in. We may never know for sure what waits in the crushing darkness of Lake Baikal. But the tragedy of 1982 teaches us a humbling lesson. We are not the masters of this planet. We are just living on the surface. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Red Archives, please help us uncover more history by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. We have hundreds of declassified files left to explore. Until next time, keep your eyes open and watch the water.